The blade came within an inch of my throat before I let myself move. I could have stopped it 3 seconds earlier. I could have ended the fight before the crowd even finished cheering for the first exchange of blows. Instead, I stepped back just enough, let the crowd gasp at how close it looked, and gave my opponent one more moment to believe he was winning. That was the job. Lose just enough to keep them satisfied. Win just enough to stay alive. Never once let anyone see what I really was. His name was Goreth, a Threskin brawler, nearly twice my height, with plates of gray armor grown straight out of his own skin. He swung again, a blow meant to end things quickly, and I ducked under it, close enough to feel the wind of it pass over my head. The arena roared around us, thousands of alien voices calling for blood in a language I understood perfectly well but had learned never to speak aloud where anyone might notice how quickly I picked it up. Sand kicked up under our boots with every step. High above, in seats reserved for nobles who never got sand on their boots, servants waved cooling fans through air that never seemed to grow any cooler. 3 years earlier, humanity lost a war it never should have started fighting. The Threskin Empire arrived from the stars with weapons that made our best defenses look like toys built for children, and inside a single month, Earth surrendered. The treaty that followed carried a name that sounded almost gentle, the Sable Accord. Under its terms, we kept our cities, our farms, our children. In exchange, we gave up something else entirely. Every year, a certain number of us were sent out to serve the Empire directly, some as laborers in Threskin factories, some in roles nobody back home liked to talk about, and some, like me, as fighters in an arena where crowds could watch conquered humans lose to Imperial champions again and again, a small, satisfying reminder of exactly who had won the war. The arena itself rose at the center of the capital like a monument built to remind the losers of a war exactly what losing looked like, its outer walls carved with the names of champions going back further than Earth's own recorded history. Human fighters lived beneath it, in a maze of cold stone cells that never fully lost their chill, guarded by soldiers who treated us the way people treat furniture, present, useful, and beneath any real notice. Almost nobody in that arena knew the truth about men like me. Before the surrender, when Earth still believed victory was possible, a classified program called Project Arsenal took 9 soldiers apart and rebuilt us from the inside out. They reinforced our skeletons until ordinary blows barely registered as more than a shove. They rewired how our muscles fired, shaving fractions of a second off every reaction. They gave each of us a strange organ near the base of the spine capable of converting raw material into something sharp enough to punch through armor plating. The transformation itself nearly killed most of us before it ever finished, and I still remembered waking from the final procedure, unable to recognize the sound of my own heartbeat, steadier and stranger than it had ever beaten before. Only a handful of us were still alive by the time the surrender was signed, and every one of the survivors understood the same unspoken rule. If the Empire ever learned what we truly were, the fragile peace protecting 6 billion people back home would not survive the discovery. I fought inside a treaty that forbade Earth from possessing weapons stronger than a simple rifle. I was that treaty's biggest secret, hiding inside a body the Empire was only ever allowed to see lose. Goreth swung a 3rd time, and I let the strike clip my shoulder, spinning me halfway around, giving the crowd a good, convincing look at pain that barely registered underneath. I staggered anyway, because staggering was part of the performance, and dropped to one knee in the sand, breathing hard for an audience that wanted to see me struggling. He raised his weapon high overhead, ready to finish things the way champions always finish them, with a blow meant to be remembered by everyone watching. I let my eyes go wide with something that looked exactly like fear. Then, at the very last possible second, I rolled aside, swept his leg out from under him, and used his own momentum to send him face first into the sand. The crowd howled with delight, not because I had won with any skill, but because it looked like nothing more than desperate, accidental luck. That was always the goal. Never let them see skill. Let them see an accident they could laugh about over dinner. I climbed back to my feet, breathing hard for effect, and finally looked up toward the royal section for the first time since the fight had started. That was when I saw her. She was not clapping the way the rest of the crowd clapped. She sat perfectly still, one hand resting against the rail in front of her, watching me with an expression I could not read at all. She wore silver and deep blue, the colors of the ruling house, and her eyes carried the faint violet shine that marked true Threscan royalty. I had heard of her before, the way every human on the planet eventually heard the same handful of rumors. Princess Kiriel Vantar, only daughter of Emperor Threll, famous across the empire for turning away every suitor sent to win her hand, and rumored to have a gift that let her see straight through people who thought they had something to hide. She was not looking at me the way the rest of the arena looked at fighters. She was looking at me like she had heard something the entire crowd around her had completely missed. I broke the look first, dropping into the same bow every fighter gave the royal box after a match, and let my handlers pull me back toward the fighter's tunnel before I could think any further about what I had just seen in her face. Backstage, I let the mask fall for exactly as long as it took to reach the wall, pressing my palm flat against cool stone, breathing slowly until my pulse settled into something closer to normal. A fellow prisoner named Marcus fell into step beside me, grinning the easy grin of a man who had watched the whole fight from the tunnel entrance. "Lucky roll at the end there," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, hard enough that I had to remind myself to flinch. "One of these days, that luck runs out, Cole." "Probably," I said, because agreeing was easier than explaining, and because some part of me had started to believe my own excuse might actually be true one day. "You see the princess up there?" Marcus asked, lowering his voice as we passed a pair of guards who weren't listening to either of us. "Whole royal box, looking half asleep, and she's the only one who didn't look bored out of her skull. Strange woman." "Didn't notice," I lied. Marcus didn't know what I was. Nobody in that cell block did. As far as any of them understood, I was simply a soldier who had survived more fights than statistics said I should have. Stubborn or fortunate, depending on who was telling the story. I preferred it that way. 3 years, and I had never once let anyone see past the act. Not the guards, not the healers, who patched up wounds that were never as bad as they looked. Not the other fighters, who shared my cell block and genuinely believed luck alone kept me breathing. I told myself the look from the royal box meant nothing. Nobles watched fighters constantly, always hunting for some new detail to gossip about over dinner. I told myself that by tomorrow she would have forgotten my face entirely, one more conquered soldier blending into hundreds of others just like him. I was wrong, and I found out exactly how wrong before the sun had fully set. The summons arrived less than an hour later. 2 royal guards in ceremonial armor walked into the fighter's block, and every prisoner in the hall went silent the moment they called my name. Guards did not visit the block unless something had gone badly wrong, or unless someone with real power wanted a fighter removed quietly rather than in public. I walked between them through corridors of polished white stone lined with banners older than my own country's founding, up staircases built for people far more important than a conquered soldier from a defeated planet, past windows that looked out over a capital I had never once been allowed to see from this high, until we reached a hall so vast that my own footsteps echoed back at me from 3 directions at once. The emperor sat at the far end on a raised platform. Beside him stood the princess. Beside her stood a tall, sharp-eyed man in dark robes I would come to know far too well in the days ahead, Lord Draven Kesh. Even then, before I understood exactly who he was or what he did for the Empire, something about the way he studied me made the hair rise along the back of my neck. The guards forced me down onto my knees. I kept my head low, the way 3 years of survival had taught me to do around anyone holding real power over my life. "Rise," said the Emperor, in a voice that filled the entire hall without needing to be raised. I rose. "My daughter has made a request," he said, in the flat tone of a man who did not enjoy the request at all, but understood he had no honest way around it. "One I am obligated by ancient law to honor, whether I wish to or not." I still did not understand, not fully, not until Kyrielle stepped forward, her violet eyes locked onto mine with the same unreadable focus I had felt from the royal box. "Under the old right of choosing," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "I claim this human as my intended mate." The hall erupted into noise, nobles gasping in open outrage, guards shifting uneasily against the walls. Somewhere behind me, a voice muttering a word that sounded exactly like a curse in 3 different languages at once. I stood frozen at the center of it all, running through every possible response I could give and finding none of them safe. 3 years I had survived by staying invisible, by being exactly forgettable enough to disappear inside a crowd of conquered soldiers. Now the most powerful woman on the entire planet had just pointed a spotlight directly at my chest in front of the whole imperial court, and I had no way yet of knowing how much heat that spotlight would bring, or how close it would eventually come to burning away everything Project Arsenal had built me to hide. All I knew, standing there in that echoing hall with every eye in the room suddenly fixed on me, was that the easy part of my mission had just ended, and whatever came next was going to be far harder than anything an arena had ever thrown at me. 3 years of losing fights on purpose had prepared me for pain, for humiliation, for the slow grinding patience survival sometimes demanded. Nothing in that training had prepared me for a princess who looked at me and saw the one thing I could never afford to let anyone see. 3 nobles wanted me dead before I finished my first meal inside the palace. I heard them through the wall of the chamber they had given me, a room built for someone far more important than a conquered soldier who had spent the last 3 years losing fights on purpose to stay alive. Threscan hearing carried further than human ears could usually manage, but their walls were never built with human ears in mind either, and mine, thanks to a program nobody here knew existed, had learned to listen better than most. "The old right of choosing has not been invoked in 6 generations, one voice said, low and clipped. "She cannot possibly mean to keep him. She has already kept him," another answered. "The only question left is how long he survives the keeping." "My son was passed over for this," a third voice said, sharper than the first 2. "Passed over for a conquered soldier who fights for scraps in an arena. The insult alone should be answered." A fourth voice, quieter than the others, said something I almost missed entirely. "Then we make certain the answer is not long at all." I set down the food I had barely touched and stared at the door, waiting to see whether survival was about to become an immediate problem or a slow one. When no one came through the door, I told myself slow was still bad, but at least slow gave me time to think. Being claimed as a princess's intended mate, I learned quickly, came with an impressive title and almost no actual protection. Consort-elect. A word the palace staff pronounced with carefully blank faces, the specific kind of blank face people wear when they have already decided exactly what they think of you and are simply waiting for permission to say it out loud. Servants who would not meet my eyes still managed to bow at exactly the correct depth, no more and no less than protocol demanded, a small, precise cruelty dressed up as perfect manners. By midday, I understood the full shape of my new life. Every noble house that had once hoped to marry a son or daughter into the royal line now saw me standing directly in the way of that ambition, and every single one of them wanted me removed before the arrangement could become permanent. They could not simply have me killed outright. The old right of choosing, whatever else it meant, made me untouchable through ordinary methods, at least while I remained inside palace grounds under formal protection. What it did not make me was untouchable by their customs, and Threscan custom, I was quickly discovering, offered plenty of paths toward the same outcome. A court physician examined me that same morning, a brisk, businesslike woman who pressed cold instruments against my chest and frowned at readings that came back stubbornly, perfectly ordinary. Project Arsenal had built us to pass exactly this kind of inspection, every enhancement calibrated to whisper rather than shout at anything short of a full biological scan. She checked twice, muttered something about human physiology being cruder than she expected, and sent me on my way, none the wiser. I let out a breath I had been holding since she first raised the instrument, understanding for the first time just how many small tests like this one I was going to have to pass, quietly, every single day, for as long as I stayed inside these walls. Lord Sarnak found me first, in a courtyard where I had gone looking for air that did not smell like polished stone and old ceremony. He was tall, even by Threscan noble standards, carrying himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never once lost an argument inside his own household and likely assumed the rest of the universe operated the same way. "You do not belong here," he said, without offering any greeting first. "I've been told that a few times already today," I said. "At least the feedback's consistent." His eyes narrowed at the joke, the particular narrowing most Threscans reserved for anything resembling humor from a species they considered several rungs beneath them on whatever ladder mattered to nobility like him. "There is a way to settle this properly," he said. "A trial of worth, older custom than the right of choosing itself. If the princess insists on an unworthy mate, that mate may prove himself through combat, or be removed by it, cleanly and within the law." I understood the offer for exactly what it was. Not a fair test of anything. A public execution wearing better manners than most executions bothered with. "And if I refuse the trial?" I asked. "Then the entire court will understand the human was too afraid to fight for what he claims to want," Sarnak said, something close to satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Refuse, and the princess loses far more than a suitor she barely knows. She loses standing at her own father's court, standing she will need for the rest of her reign. You would be doing her a kindness, human, ending this before it costs her anything real." That was the detail that made refusing impossible. I had spent 3 years protecting a secret by losing fights on purpose, carefully, believably, without ever drawing a second look. For the first time since arriving on this planet, losing was not an option available to me, and neither, I understood immediately, was winning by anything close to the margin I was actually capable of. The trial was set for 2 days later, inside a smaller arena on the palace grounds itself, reserved for matters the Empire preferred to keep well away from common crowds and their unpredictable attention. I spent those 2 days learning the shape of my new home, and learning it faster than I liked admitting I needed to. Kyriel found me on the first evening, in a garden behind the consort's quarters, staring up at a sky carrying 2 moons instead of the single one I had grown up under. "You never asked me why I chose you," she said, settling onto the bench beside me without waiting for any kind of invitation. "Figured you'd tell me eventually, one way or another. My bloodline carries something called the resonance sense," she said. "It has passed through the royal line for longer than any written record we still possess. It is meant to show me the truth of a person underneath everything they choose to present to the rest of the world. Most people show very little beneath that surface, if I am honest. Ambition, usually. Sometimes fear, carefully hidden behind confidence they don't actually feel. What did I show?" She studied me for a long, careful moment before answering, the kind of pause that told me she was choosing her words with real precision. "Something enormous," she said finally, held very, very still. "That sounds more like a riddle than an answer," I said. "Most true things do, at first," she said. "I did not choose you because I understood what I felt, Ethan Cole. I chose you because I have spent my whole life surrounded by people whose surface and depths are exactly the same thing, and something in me could not walk away from the first person who was not." I kept my face as calm as 3 years of practice allowed, the same careful calm I had used in front of guards and healers and handlers who all wanted something specific from me. It was harder to hold that calm in front of her than it had ever been in front of anyone else on this entire planet, and I did not particularly like how much harder it was proving to be. "Maybe your resonance sense is broken," I said. "I'm just a fighter who got lucky in a dangerous line of work, same as any other prisoner in that arena." "Perhaps," she said, in a tone that made clear she believed nothing close to that explanation. "I am not asking you to explain yourself tonight. Ethan Cole, I am telling you plainly that whatever you are hiding, I already know there is something there to hide. I would rather you trust me with it eventually, on your own terms, than have someone less patient uncover it first, on theirs." I almost told her everything right there in that garden under 2 rising moons. The only thing that stopped me was the memory of a briefing 3 years old now, a voice telling 9 frightened soldiers that the program did not exist, had never existed, and would never be spoken of outside a short, carefully guarded list of people cleared to know the truth. Some of those 9 soldiers were already dead by then. The rest of us stayed silent because silence was the only thing keeping a fragile treaty intact, and that treaty was the only thing standing between Earth and a second war it had no real chance of surviving. I could not tell her the whole truth. I discovered, with some surprise, that I did not particularly want to lie to her either, not the way I lied to everyone else without a second thought. So I said nothing at all, and she let the silence stand between us without pushing, and somehow that quiet felt like the most honest exchange I had managed with anyone since arriving on this planet 3 long years earlier. The trial arrived faster than I wanted it to. The private arena filled with nobles rather than common crowds, which meant sharper eyes watching and far better memories for detail afterward. My opponent was a champion named Ordeth, chosen specifically, I learned later, for his particular skill at making victories look effortless and inevitable. Sarnak wanted a clean, thoroughly convincing defeat. He wanted the entire court to watch the human embarrassed thoroughly before he watched the human removed permanently. I had spent 3 years mastering the difficult art of losing believably. I had never once practiced the far harder art of winning just enough, and not 1 degree more than that. Ordeth came at me hard from the very first exchange, testing my reflexes with quick, probing strikes meant to gather information as much as inflict damage. I let 2 of them land cleanly, absorbing the impact the way I always did, letting my body sell pain that barely registered underneath the performance. Around us, the private arena stayed almost entirely silent. None of the roaring, chaotic energy of the public crowds outside. Just cold, calculating stares from people quietly deciding whether I deserved to exist inside their world at all. I studied Ordeth carefully as he moved, circling, testing, waiting. He was genuinely good, better than any opponent I had faced inside the public arena, but he fought like a man who had never once faced someone deliberately hiding a fraction of their real strength from him. I let the fight run longer than it needed to, trading blows I could have ended in seconds, absorbing strikes that left visible marks I would carry for effect long after they had already finished healing underneath, buying myself time to work out exactly how convincing a victory needed to look without revealing anything of what sat underneath the performance. Near the end, I saw my opening. A half-second where his guard dropped low after a strike he fully expected to land solidly against me. I did not take that opening the way Project Arsenal had trained me to take it. I took it the way an unusually determined, somewhat fortunate human soldier might take it instead, sweeping his balance out from under him and relying on ordinary leverage rather than anything faster than it had any right to be. He went down hard. He did not get back up. The court's silence changed shape in that moment, shifting from cold evaluation into something closer to genuine confusion. I had won too cleanly for a man they fully expected to lose, but not cleanly enough to look like anything more than human effort, mixed with a healthy dose of human luck. Sarnak's face, when I finally found it in the crowd, had gone very still and very pale. Someone else's face had also gone still, and that particular stillness worried me far more than Sarnak's disappointment did. Lord Draven Kesh stood near the Emperor's private box, arms folded across his chest, watching me with the exact expression of a man reviewing a puzzle that had just gained one more piece than he had been expecting to find. He said nothing at all. He did not need to say anything. I had seen that look before, back on Earth, in the eyes of officers who suspected a soldier of hiding something significant, and had all the patience in the world required to prove it eventually. That night, long after the palace had gone quiet around me, a message reached me through channels the treaty officially insisted did not exist, delivered by a low-ranking servant palace security would never think to suspect of anything at all, a young woman who emptied my ash bin every evening without ever once meeting my eyes. It was short, coded in a way only a handful of people alive would ever recognize. Stay hidden, whatever the cost. Command cannot protect what it does not officially know exists. Elena Brooks. I read it twice before letting the paper dissolve completely inside a basin of water, the same way I had been trained years ago to destroy anything capable of exposing me to the wrong eyes. Stay hidden, whatever the cost. 2 days earlier, that order would have been simple enough to follow without a second thought. Now I had a princess who suspected something enormous was hiding directly underneath my skin, a spy master watching me the exact way a hunter watches fresh tracks in soft ground, and an entire court full of nobles who had just failed once to remove me and were unlikely to fail quietly a second time. I looked out at the twin moons hanging over the palace and understood, for the very first time since the claiming ceremony, that hiding and surviving were no longer going to mean the same thing on this planet. Command wanted a ghost. The court wanted a corpse. Somewhere between the two of them stood a woman who wanted the truth, and I had no idea yet which one of the three I was actually going to be able to give. The wine was poisoned, and I knew it before Kyriel's cup ever touched her lips. I smelled it the instant a servant set the tray down between us, a faint bitterness hiding beneath the sweetness of the Threskin harvest wine, wrong in a way nobody else at that long dinner table would ever have noticed. 3 years of engineered senses had taught me to catch details ordinary biology simply missed. I knocked the cup from her hand before I had time to consider whether the speed of that movement looked entirely human. The cup shattered against pale stone, dark wine spreading across the floor in a widening stain, and for one long, suspended second, the entire hall stared at me instead of at the danger I had just prevented. "There is poison in the wine," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage under dozens of startled eyes. I could smell it the moment it was poured. Guards moved quickly after that, sealing off the kitchens, questioning serving staff one by one, and within the hour they confirmed it, a toxin favored by court poisoners precisely because it broke down too fast for most physicians to detect once symptoms finally appeared. Whoever ordered it had planned for a slow, deniable death, the kind that would read as sudden illness rather than obvious murder to anyone investigating afterward. The server who carried the tray swore under questioning that she had no knowledge of the poison, that the wine had been switched somewhere between the cellar and the hall by hands she never saw, and something about her genuine, unguarded terror convinced even the guards that she was telling the truth. Whoever planned this had been careful enough to leave no one behind who actually knew their face. Kyriel sat very still through all of it, watching the guards work with the composed patience of someone raised around danger her entire life, and only once we were finally alone together in her private study did she turn the full weight of her attention onto me. "Humans cannot smell that particular toxin," she said quietly, closing the study door behind her. "I checked the physician's records myself, before tonight, out of simple curiosity about the man my resonance had chosen for me. Human senses were never built for it, according to every text I could find." I had run out of easy lies to offer her. I gave her the only truth I could still afford to share. "I've spent my whole life training to notice things other people miss," I said. "Call it instinct, call it luck, if that's easier. I'm not going to apologize for either one, not when it just saved your life at that table." She studied me for a long moment, and I watched her make a deliberate choice not to push any further, not because she believed my explanation, but because she had decided, for reasons I did not yet fully understand, to let me keep whatever else I was still hiding beneath it. "Someone wanted me dead tonight," she said instead, turning to look out the window at the darkening sky. "Not you, me specifically. Any idea who?" "Half the noble houses at court have a motive," she said, a tired, humorless smile touching the corner of her mouth. "The difficult part was never finding a suspect, it was ever finding just one." That distinction mattered more than either of us said aloud in that moment. The failed trial of worth had already removed me as an easy target, since killing me now would only make the princess who claimed me look weak rather than simply mistaken in her choice. Killing her, on the other hand, solved every problem the old noble houses had at once. No more inconvenient human consort, no more heir with opinions of her own about who deserved her hand and her throne. Word of the poisoning spread through the palace long before morning, twisted into a dozen competing rumors by the time it reached the lower halls where servants and off-duty guards traded gossip freely. Some claimed a rival house had ordered it outright. Others whispered that the emperor's own council had grown nervous about his daughter's increasingly public choices. One particularly persistent rumor insisted the poison had been meant for me all along, and that Kyriel had simply been unlucky enough to reach for the wrong cup first, a version of events I did nothing to correct, since it kept certain eyes pointed away from questions I could not yet afford to answer. Nobody said it directly to my face, but everyone seemed to understand, without needing to be told, that the conflict surrounding me had stopped being about wounded pride and started being about outright survival. Lord Draven Kesh requested a private audience with me 2 days later, and I accepted only because refusing a spy master's invitation would have been its own kind of confession, one I could not afford to make so early. His study held none of the ceremonial decoration common everywhere else in the palace. Plain shelves lined with ledgers, each one labeled in a tight, economical hand. A plain desk, uncluttered and precise, holding nothing that did not serve some clear purpose. A single chair positioned across from his own, arranged, I noticed immediately, so that light from the window would fall directly across my face, while leaving his own features comfortably shadowed. "You smelled a toxin no human physiology should register at all," he said, without offering any preamble. "You defeated a trained champion using nothing but ordinary technique, and yet moved afterward like a man who had barely exerted himself in the process. Do you know what a careful observer begins to suspect, once he notices two such details occurring within the same short span of time? That I'm either extremely well trained or extremely fortunate," I said, keeping my tone light despite the tightening in my chest. "I do not believe in fortune," Kesh said. "I believe in patterns, and in the discipline required to notice them before they become obvious to everyone else. I have spent 20 years studying the surrender terms your species agreed to, Ethan Cole. I helped draft several clauses myself, including one concerning weapons your people were explicitly forbidden from developing after the war concluded. I have begun to wonder whether that particular clause was ever truly honored, or whether it was simply hidden well enough to survive every inspection we conducted afterward." I kept my expression steady through sheer, practiced force of will. "That's a serious accusation to make without any actual proof behind it." "I have made no accusation," Kesh said. "I have made an observation, nothing more." He rose from his desk and crossed to the window, looking out over the training yards below, without turning back toward me. "I have read every surviving record from your planet's surrender negotiations, Ethan Cole. Casualty reports, equipment inventories, the full list of technologies your side agreed to abandon. Twice, in those records, I found gaps, small ones, the kind of gap a careless clerk might leave by accident, or the kind a very careful officer might leave on purpose, to protect something worth protecting." "Gaps aren't proof," I said. "No," he agreed, turning back to face me, "which is precisely why I intend to gather every piece of evidence I need before bringing this matter to the Emperor, rather than risk being wrong in front of him and wasting whatever trust I have left to spend." He let me go after that exchange, and I understood the meeting for exactly what it had been, a warning delivered with immaculate courtesy, the kind that left me no room to argue and no visible target to fight back against. I had spent 3 years successfully hiding from an entire empire's worth of suspicion. I had never once had to hide from a single man who already suspected the deeper truth and possessed all the patience in the world required to prove it eventually. I told Kiriel only part of what happened inside that study, enough to explain why Kesh's attention now sat on me like a physical weight I carried everywhere, not enough to explain everything hiding underneath that weight. "He is dangerous," she said, once I finished the edited version. "Not because he is cruel, Ethan, because he is right, far more often than anyone comfortable at this court would ever like to admit out loud. Is he right about me, specifically?" She looked at me for a long moment, 2 moons climbing slowly beyond the study window, and did not answer the question directly, the way she so often chose not to answer the questions that mattered most. "I do not need him to be right or wrong," she said instead. "I need to understand exactly what I chose, eventually, on my own terms, and not because someone else forced the truth out of you first, against your will." We spent more evenings together after that than either of us likely planned to, in gardens and quiet halls where the rest of the court rarely wandered after dark. She taught me the names of Threscan constellations that bore no resemblance to anything I had known growing up, tracing them against the sky with one finger while I pretended I would remember a single one of them by morning. "That cluster there is called the Patient Hunter," she told me one evening, pointing toward a knot of faint stars low on the horizon. "Old stories say it waits an entire season before it finally moves, and when it does, nothing outruns it." "Sounds like someone I've recently met," I said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not the careful court version she used everywhere else, and the sound of it stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. I taught her, in turn, small pieces of earth she had never once had reason to learn, songs half remembered from childhood, the particular quiet of a summer evening back home before the war ever reached our sky. She asked questions I had no good answer for: what rain smelled like before a storm, whether Earth's single moon ever felt lonely, hanging up there by itself. Neither of us spoke of resonance senses or hidden truths during those hours, and for the length of them, I let myself forget, briefly, that I was still hiding anything from her at all. One evening, walking beside a reflecting pool near the consort's quarters, I told her something real for the first time since the claiming ceremony. Not everything. Not the name of the program itself, or the exact number of soldiers who entered it, or how many came out the other side changed forever. I told her about the war instead, about watching Earth's best defenses fail within weeks against weapons we never had any real chance of matching, about volunteering for something desperate because desperate had become the only option still available on the table. "I was a soldier before any of this happened to me," I said, watching moonlight ripple across still water. "I fought because my planet was losing, and I kept fighting after we officially lost, because somebody still had to make sure losing didn't mean disappearing from the universe entirely." "That is not nothing," she said quietly, studying my face in the dim light. "That is most of the truth, Ethan, even if it is not the whole of it." I did not correct her gentle assessment. I let the almost truth stand comfortably between us, and for that one evening, it felt like enough to carry us both forward. It did not stay enough for very long. 3 days later, word reached the palace that a rebel faction, calling themselves the Ashborn, longtime opponents of the Emperor's rule, scattered loosely across the Empire's distant outer territories, had begun quietly moving warships toward the capital system itself. I heard the news secondhand, through a guard captain complaining to another about cancelled leave, and only understood the full weight of it later that evening, when Kiriel returned from a closed council session looking more tired than I had ever seen her. "They call it a grievance about taxes," she said, dropping into a chair across from me without her usual careful posture. "Unequal treatment of conquered worlds, unfair tribute demands, the usual language rebellions use when they want to sound reasonable. My father's advisors believe it is nothing more than that. I do not. What do you believe? I believe grievances do not usually arrive with warships, she said. I believe someone patient has been waiting for exactly the kind of instability a scandal like ours provides. And I believe we have just handed them the perfect moment to stop waiting. Their public complaints centered on unfair tax burdens and unequal treatment of conquered worlds under imperial law. Their private goal, according to whispered palace intelligence passed carefully between trusted officials, was far simpler than any tax dispute. They wanted the throne destabilized enough to strike successfully, and a scandal involving a human consort tearing the royal court apart from the inside made an unusually convenient moment to finally attempt it. Security around the entire palace tightened overnight, guard rotations doubling, checkpoints appearing in corridors that had never needed them before. I noticed the change most in the small things: a guard who lingered a moment too long outside my door, a servant who asked one question too many about my daily schedule under the guise of simple courtesy. Kesh's private investigation, rather than slowing under the pressure of this new external threat, seemed instead to accelerate, as though he understood better than almost anyone else at court that instability arriving from outside and secrets festering inside might be more closely connected than anyone else had yet considered. I received a second message from Elena Brooks 2 nights before everything finally came apart at once, delivered again through channels the Empire officially pretended did not exist within its own borders. Command has learned about the Ashbourne movement toward the capital. If the throne falls into chaos, Earth's position within the treaty becomes renegotiable by force rather than by law. Do not intervene under any circumstances whatsoever. Exposure now would hand the Empire's hardliners exactly the justification they have wanted for 3 long years. Whatever happens, stay hidden. This is a direct order, not a request. I read the message 3 separate times before destroying it completely, understanding exactly what it demanded of me, and exactly how impossible it was going to be to actually follow through on. Command wanted me rendered invisible during the one event most likely to place Kyriel directly in mortal danger. I understood their logic perfectly well. Exposure truly could unravel the fragile piece holding Earth together by a single thread, and 6 billion people back home had no say at all in a decision that could cost them everything. I also understood, with a certainty that had nothing whatsoever to do with orders from anyone, that I was not going to stand quietly in some hallway and watch her die in order to protect a secret, no matter what command back on Earth ultimately decided that secret was worth in the larger scheme of things. 3 years earlier, I had accepted a program that rebuilt my body specifically so that I could make choices like this one, and no one, not command, not the treaty, not the fragile peace itself, was going to make this particular choice for me. The formal accusation came the following afternoon, delivered not through careful whispers this time, but through the front doors of the Emperor's council chamber, where Lord Draven Kesh formally requested a full hearing regarding what he called irregularities in the human consort's conduct and physical capability. Word of the request traveled through the palace faster than any rumor about the poisoning had, and by the time I heard of it secondhand, half the court already seemed to know more about my own hearing than I did. I stood outside those heavy doors, summoned to answer questions I had spent 3 entire years carefully learning never to answer honestly, and felt the accumulated weight of every lie I had ever told settle onto a single, narrow afternoon. Before the hearing could properly begin, before a single formal question was even asked aloud, the alarm bells started ringing across the capital. Not the ceremonial bells reserved for royal announcements and public celebrations. The deep, urgent bells kept for a single grim purpose across the entire history of the palace. The ones meant to warn an entire capital city that an attack had already begun in earnest. Kesh's accusation froze, half-spoken in the council chamber doorway, the words dying in his throat. Guards scattered toward defensive positions along every wall. Nobles who moments earlier had been arranging themselves for a comfortable afternoon of scandal now shoved past each other toward the exits, formality abandoned entirely in favor of simple survival. Somewhere high above the palace, engines that belonged to no Threscan patrol ship screamed across the darkening sky, close enough now that the windows along the corridor rattled faintly in their frames, and I understood, standing perfectly still in a hallway suddenly full of panicking nobles, that command's order to stay hidden was about to become entirely impossible for me to obey any longer. The attack came from above and below at once, unmarked ships breaking through the capital's outer defense screen, while operatives already planted inside the palace walls moved the instant the first alarm sounded across the grounds. Smoke rose from somewhere near the eastern gate, thick and dark against a sky that moments earlier had been perfectly clear, and the deep bells kept ringing without pause, a sound built specifically to travel through stone, thick enough to muffle almost anything else. I would learn later that the Ashborn had spent months quietly placing their people inside the palace staff, patiently waiting for exactly this kind of chaos to finally give them the cover they needed. I did not wait around to learn any of that in the moment. I ran. The council chamber doors burst open behind me as guards scrambled desperately into defensive positions, and I pushed hard through the crowd of fleeing nobles toward the one place I absolutely needed to be, the private garden where Kyriel had been walking calmly before the hearing began, guarded by only 2 escorts who were about to find themselves badly outnumbered by professionals. I found her there exactly as I had feared, backed hard against a stone wall by 4 armed figures dressed in dark, unmarked gear the Ashborn used specifically to hide their true identities from witnesses. Her 2 escorts already lay motionless on the garden path behind them, and for one terrible second I registered nothing else in the world except the distance still separating me from her. She held a small ceremonial blade in one steady hand, more symbol than genuine weapon, wearing the calm, furious expression of someone fully intending to make her own death as difficult and costly as possible for whoever came to collect it. I stopped pretending the very moment I saw her cornered like that. 3 years of careful holding back ended in the narrow space between one heartbeat and the next. I felt the reinforced structure beneath my skin respond exactly the way it had been built to respond, muscles firing at speeds no baseline human frame could ever hope to manage, the strange forge running along my spine converting a handful of loose stone from the garden path into something sharp and fast before my closest attacker had even fully registered that I entered the fight at all. The first Ashborn operative went down before he finished turning to face me directly. The second brought his weapon up in response, and I closed the distance between us faster than his reflexes could possibly track, taking the weapon cleanly from his grip and ending the exchange before he ever got the chance to fire it into the crowd. A third came at me from the side, and I caught the blow on my forearm instead of avoiding it entirely, letting the impact tell me exactly where the next strike would come from. I felt solid impacts land against my arm and shoulder that would have shattered an ordinary man's bones without much effort, and simply kept moving forward, my body absorbing the damage the way I had spent 3 careful years pretending it never could. The last 2 operatives, watching the first pair fall in mere seconds, made the exact mistake every trained fighter eventually makes when facing something they cannot fully understand. They hesitated, just for a moment, trying to recalculate, glancing at each other as though one of them might have a better answer than the other. I did not hesitate at all. When it finally ended, 4 attackers lay defeated across the garden path, and I stood in the wreckage of every careful lie I had told since first arriving on this planet, breathing hard, not from any real exhaustion, but from the simple human fact of adrenaline finally catching up to what my body had already finished doing without me. Kyriel stared at me across the garden, the ceremonial blade still gripped tightly in her hand, her violet eyes wide with an expression that was not quite fear, and not quite anything I had a ready name for. "What are you?" she said quietly, not a question asked in anger, or even in accusation, a question asked by someone finally hearing, out loud, the full answer her resonance sense had been trying to tell her since the very first moment we met in that arena. I had rehearsed 100 versions of this moment over 3 years, always assuming it would come from an interrogator or a blade at my throat, never once from someone standing in front of me with an expression closer to wonder than fear. None of my rehearsed answers fit what her face was actually asking me. I did not get the chance to answer her properly, not yet. More guards arrived quickly, drawn by the sudden noise, and behind them, moving faster than a man his age should reasonably have been able to move, came Lord Draven Kesh, the very same man who had been barely half a sentence into formally accusing me of exactly what he was now witnessing directly with his own eyes. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked first at the 4 defeated attackers scattered across the path, then at me, then at the shattered pieces of ordinary stone strewn everywhere, gravel that used to be nothing more than garden decoration, before something inside my own body turned it into a functioning weapon in seconds. His eyes moved over the scene with the same careful precision I had watched him apply to evidence and testimony for weeks, cataloging, measuring, already building the report he would eventually have to write about all of it. "I was right," he said quietly, and for once, in our short acquaintance, he did not sound especially satisfied about having been proven correct. There was no more room left for denial, not with a full dozen guards standing as direct witnesses, not with Kyrielle standing 3 feet away, having watched every second of it unfold with her own eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a great deal like Elena Brooks reminded me exactly what silence had bought Earth for 3 years. I made a choice in that exact moment that command would never have approved of, and I did not regret making it, even as the words left my mouth. "My name is Ethan Cole," I said, loud enough for everyone gathered in that garden to hear clearly. "Before the surrender, I was part of a classified program called Project Arsenal. 9 of us were rebuilt from the inside out to keep fighting a war Earth was already about to lose. The treaty that ended that war was supposed to erase every single trace of that program from existence. It did not. It only ever taught the survivors how to hide better." The words felt strange leaving my mouth after 3 long years of careful silence, like a muscle finally stretched after being held tense for far too long without relief. Somewhere behind Kesh, a young guard who had escorted me through these halls just that morning stared at me like he was seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face, which, I supposed, was exactly what he was seeing. The attack was not finished yet, not by any measure. Deeper inside the palace, other pockets of fighting still raged on, Ashbourne operatives pressing hard toward the throne room itself, and whatever confession I owed the watching court, it would clearly have to wait until the larger, more immediate threat was fully handled first. I looked at Kyrielle, still visibly shaken, but already recovering the sharp composure that had first drawn my attention to her in that arena, and asked the only question that truly mattered in that narrow moment. "Trust me for the next hour," I said. "Ask every question you want, the second this is over. Right now, people are still actively trying to kill your father." She held my gaze steadily for 1 long second, then nodded once, firmly, and that single small nod told me everything I needed to know about exactly what kind of woman I had somehow ended up choosing, or perhaps being chosen by, in equal measure. Most people, faced with proof that the man beside them was something entirely different than they believed, would have taken a step back. She took a step forward instead, matching my pace as we moved deeper into the palace. What followed was the first full hour since arriving on this planet that I fought without holding anything back at all. I moved through corridors I had only ever walked before at the careful, unremarkable pace of a defeated species' quiet representative, past tapestries torn from the walls in the chaos and doors kicked from their hinges, meeting Ashbourne operatives with speed and force I had spent 3 long years burying under fake stumbles and conveniently timed injuries. Guards who had spent the entire morning treating me with polite, distant suspicion found themselves fighting alongside something they did not fully understand and, in the heat of the moment, simply did not have time left to question. A few even fell into step beside me, matching whatever gap in the fighting I opened without needing to be told twice. We reached the throne room together eventually, guards and consort-elect, and, trailing close behind, a visibly stunned Lord Kesh, just as the last determined wave of Ashbourne operatives attempted to finally breach the Emperor's personal guard. The corridor outside the throne room had narrowed into a bottleneck. Defenders and attackers pressed close enough that ordinary soldiers could barely swing a weapon without striking their own side, and I moved through the crush the only way that made sense anymore, without holding back a fraction of what I actually had left to give. I ended that particular fight faster than any that came before it that day, 3 years of careful restraint finally spending itself in a handful of decisive, controlled minutes, and when the corridor at last fell quiet, Emperor Threl Vantar stood very much alive behind a thin line of his own remaining soldiers, staring at the same impossible sight everyone else inside the palace had already witnessed firsthand. The Emperor lowered his own personal weapon slowly, breathing hard from a fight he was clearly not accustomed to finding himself inside of, and looked at me the way a man looks at a puzzle he suspects has just quietly cost him an entire war he never even realized he was fighting until this moment. "You are not what your treaty claimed you were," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the settling dust. "No," I said simply, "I am not." Silence spread through the throne room, broken only by the distant, fading sound of the last few skirmishes being cleared elsewhere throughout the palace grounds. Kiriel stepped up beside me then, not behind me, not in front of me, deliberately beside me, and the simple choice of position said something important to the watching court that I strongly suspected she intended it to say clearly. "He just saved both your life and mine," she said to her father, her voice steady and carrying. "Whatever else he is, whatever he has been hiding from all of us, that fact happened first, before anything else matters." A few of the guards nearest us, still catching their breath, nodded slightly at that, small gestures they likely did not realize they were making. The Emperor looked back and forth between his only daughter and the man standing calmly beside her, a man his own spymaster had been mere sentences away from formally accusing less than a single hour earlier, and I watched him understand, the way rulers eventually have to understand difficult things, that the simple story he had been told about this particular day was no longer the only story now available to him. "This is not a matter I can properly resolve, standing in a hallway still stained with this morning's fighting," he said finally, looking around at the gathered guards and nobles, at the scorched wall behind his own throne, at the blood on the floor that belonged to neither his family nor his court. "There will be a full and proper hearing. Every question will be asked openly. Every answer will be required in full." His eyes moved deliberately to Kesh, who still had not fully recovered his usual careful composure. "And every piece of evidence you have gathered these past weeks, Lord Kesh, will be heard alongside everything else we learn." Kesh inclined his head slowly, the very picture of composed obedience, but I caught something else flickering across his expression before he fully mastered it again, something that looked almost like quiet relief. He had spent weeks chasing a truth that made him look increasingly paranoid to everyone else around him at court. Now the whole palace had watched that truth stand in a garden, with blood not its own staining its hands, and whatever came next for any of us, at least nobody would ever call him wrong about it again. I stood in that throne room, surrounded by a court that finally understood exactly what Earth had actually sent to their planet 3 years earlier without their knowledge, and felt something I had genuinely not expected to feel after finally letting the mask fall away completely. Relief. Plain and simple. Not because the danger had passed, since I understood well enough that a far more complicated danger was only just beginning. Relief, because for the first time in 3 years, my body and my truth were finally standing in the same place, at the same time, in front of the same people, and nothing about that felt like the disaster I had spent 3 years bracing myself for. Whatever the coming hearing decided, whatever command back on Earth would eventually say about a direct order broken in the middle of an active attack, I was finished pretending to be smaller than I actually was, just to survive another day. I thought of the 8 other soldiers who had gone through Project Arsenal beside me, of how many of them might still be hiding somewhere across the stars, the exact way I had hidden for 3 long years, waiting for a moment that might never come for them, the way it had just come for me. The only real question left now was whether the truth I had just revealed to an entire watching empire would end in a lasting peace, or end up unraveling everything the original treaty had ever been built to prevent in the first place. Every noble seated in that chamber held enough influence to end my planet's fragile peace with a single word, and I was about to hand them every reason they needed to do exactly that. The hearing began the next morning, inside a chamber built centuries earlier for exactly this single purpose: judgment. Every noble house holding any real standing at court filled the surrounding seats, their expressions ranging from open hostility to careful, guarded curiosity. Lord Draven Kesh stood at the center of the chamber floor, presenting evidence he had spent weeks patiently gathering, evidence that no longer needed to convince anyone of anything at all, since half the palace had already watched the truth happen in person the day before. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, laying out dates and observations in the same measured voice he had used in his own study, and I found myself almost grateful for his thoroughness. A lie would have been easy to poke holes in. The truth, delivered plainly, left nothing for anyone in that chamber to argue with. "The human known as Ethan Cole," Kesh said, addressing the Emperor directly in a clear, carrying voice, "possesses physical capabilities far exceeding baseline human limits in every measurable respect. Enhanced strength beyond reasonable explanation. Accelerated healing. Some manner of internal mechanism capable of producing functional weapons from raw material on demand. I believe this represents a direct and deliberate violation of the Sable Accord's explicit prohibition on advanced human weaponry." "I do not dispute a single word of that," I said, when the Emperor's gaze finally turned to me across the chamber. "Everything Lord Kesh has just described is entirely true." A ripple of open surprise moved through the watching nobles at that admission. Somewhere behind me, I heard Lord Sarnak's voice, the same noble who had once tried to have me removed through a rigged trial of worth, mutter something to a neighbor about vindication, though he had the sense not to say it loudly enough for the Emperor to notice. I suspected the rest of the chamber had expected denial, or careful excuses, or the kind of practiced diplomatic language Earth's remaining representatives usually offered whenever cornered by imperial authority. I had spent 3 years lying with my body instead of my words. I was not about to spend this particular hearing lying with either one. "Then explain it to this chamber," the Emperor said, leaning forward slightly on his raised seat. "Explain clearly why a defeated species built something explicitly forbidden by the very treaty it signed in good faith, and then hid that violation inside a man deliberately sent to lose fights in an arena for my court's simple entertainment." I looked around that crowded chamber at faces ranging from curious to openly hostile to carefully unreadable, and told them the truth I had carried alone for 3 long years without relief. Before the surrender, Earth was losing a war it never had any honest chance of winning, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Your empire's technology outmatched ours in every measurable way that mattered. Project Arsenal was not built with any real hope of winning that war outright. It was built because our commanders already understood the war was effectively lost, and they wanted something left standing afterward that could protect whatever remained of us if the coming peace ever failed us completely. 9 soldiers went through that program from beginning to end. I am one of only 3 still alive today. A hidden weapon remains a weapon regardless of its original intention," Kesh said, his tone measured rather than accusing now. "Yes," I said simply, "it does. And I have spent 3 full years choosing, every single day, not to use it, even when losing meant real and lasting pain, even when it meant standing by and watching lesser men claim victories that should never rightfully have been theirs. I lost fights I did not have to lose, because winning as what I truly am would have shattered the one fragile thing standing between my entire planet and a second war it could never hope to survive. I did not finally use what I am yesterday because I wanted to. I used it because the only alternative was standing motionless in a hallway while your princess died in a garden a few short steps away. The chamber fell quiet at that, quiet enough that I clearly heard Kyrielle shift in her seat before rising smoothly to speak, something the formal hearing rules apparently still allowed for a member of the royal bloodline, even in matters this serious. "I would like to offer my own testimony to this chamber," she said, and the emperor, after a brief, considering pause, nodded his permission for her to continue. "I did not choose this man because my resonance sense detected a hidden weapon inside him," she said, turning slowly to address the full gathered court, rather than just her father. "I chose him because it detected restraint, something enormous, held very still, for reasons I did not fully understand myself until only yesterday. I have spent weeks, quietly watching him lose arguments he could easily have won outright. I watched him accept insults he could have answered a dozen different ways. I watched him absorb blows in that garden yesterday that would have killed any ordinary man instantly, without once complaining afterward about the pain he must have felt underneath it all. Whatever Project Arsenal built him to become, he spent 3 entire years choosing not to become it, right up until the exact moment my own life required otherwise of him. I do not believe that pattern describes a hidden threat to this empire. I believe it describes a man who understood precisely how much damage the simple truth could do to everyone around him, and chose to carry that heavy weight alone, rather than risk his entire planet's safety for his own personal comfort." A few of the older nobles exchanged glances at that, the kind of glance that suggested her words had reached further than she perhaps intended, past the narrow question of my guilt, and into the much larger question of what kind of ruler she herself might someday become. Kesh had no immediate answer ready for that, and I watched something shift subtly in his expression, the particular stillness of a careful man quietly reconsidering a conclusion he had been entirely certain of only weeks earlier. "I do not doubt the restraint you describe so clearly, Princess," he said eventually, choosing his words with obvious care. "I do doubt whether restraint freely chosen today can honestly guarantee restraint forever, under every future circumstance. Treaties are never built on the good character of specific individuals, however admirable that character might genuinely be. They are built on firm limits that do not depend on anyone's personal choices at all, now or later." "Then perhaps the treaty itself needs honest revising," Kyrielle said evenly, "rather than the man currently standing in violation of it, needing punishment simply for surviving a war his side already lost honestly, at terrible cost." The emperor raised one hand before the exchange could continue further, and the entire chamber fell silent immediately, the particular way rooms full of nobles learn over generations to fall silent around absolute authority. "I did not summon this hearing today to decide whether Earth built something forbidden under our treaty," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the chamber. "Clearly, it did, and the evidence of that is beyond honest dispute now. I summoned this hearing to decide what that established fact means going forward, because yesterday's attack made one thing abundantly clear to me personally. My empire has genuine enemies hiding inside its own borders, entirely willing to exploit any weakness they can find and exploit patiently. A defeated species kept deliberately too weak to defend even itself becomes exactly that kind of exploitable weakness, a convenient target for anyone patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike directly at my own throne through it." He looked at me for a long, measuring moment, and I understood, watching him think it through carefully in real time, that I was witnessing a ruler recalculate an entire generation of settled policy right in front of his own court. Around the chamber, nobles who had spent the morning ready to condemn me sat very still, watching their emperor arrive at a conclusion none of them had expected, and few of them, I suspected, were prepared to argue with directly. The Sable Accord was originally built on the comfortable assumption that a broken Earth posed no further threat to anyone and required no further serious consideration beyond simple, ongoing control, the Emperor continued. Yesterday, a broken Earth's hidden soldier saved both my own life and my only daughter's life. At the exact moment, my own court's internal conflicts left us both dangerously exposed to outside enemies. I have no genuine interest in punishing the one part of that old treaty that actually protected my throne when it mattered most. Kesh's head tilted slightly at that, the careful posture of a man quietly recalculating his own position within the room. You intend to let the violation itself stand unpunished, he said. It was not quite phrased as a question. I intend to renegotiate what that violation means going forward, the Emperor said firmly. Earth will no longer be treated as a defeated territory required to survive purely on whatever limited charity my court chooses to extend toward it. It will be treated instead as a smaller power fully capable of defending itself. Within firm limits, both sides agree to honestly and openly, rather than limits one side merely pretends to honor while quietly hiding the truth beneath a fighter's skin inside my own arena. He turned to look directly at Kesh. You will personally lead these coming negotiations, Lord Kesh, precisely because you were the one single person inside this entire palace who never once stopped questioning our old arrangement, even when doing so cost you standing with nearly everyone around you. I would rather build a lasting new treaty on the sound judgment of a man who reliably catches what others carelessly miss, than on the comfortable ignorance of people who simply preferred not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. It was, I realized, while watching Kesh absorb this unexpected assignment, the closest thing to a genuine apology an emperor was ever likely to offer a spy master for having doubted him for weeks, and the closest thing to real trust a spy master was ever likely to receive for having been entirely right about something everyone else at court had quietly preferred to ignore. Kesh inclined his head slowly in response, and for the very first time since I had met him, something in his careful expression came close to genuine approval. The formal hearing ended roughly an hour later, though its full consequences would clearly take much longer to properly settle across the empire. Word of the day's remarkable events would need to reach Earth eventually, and Command would need to decide how best to respond to a direct order broken in the middle of an active attack. A closely guarded secret exposed before an entire imperial court, and a treaty about to be completely rewritten from the ground up because of it. I did not yet know whether Elena Brooks and the rest of Command would consider what happened here a genuine disaster or a door finally opening after 3 long years locked firmly shut. I suspected, knowing them as well as I did, it would take a good while before even they knew which one it truly was. What I did know, standing quietly in a palace garden that same evening beneath the same 2 moons that had watched me hide successfully for 3 straight years, was that I was simply tired of being anyone's secret any longer. Kiriel found me there eventually, the ceremonial blade from the day before nowhere in sight now, her formal court dress replaced by something simpler and quieter, clearly meant for a private evening rather than a public hearing. You could have told everyone that Command's order to stay hidden meant nothing at all once you finally decided to break it, she said, settling beside me on the familiar stone bench. Instead, you told this entire court the truth, that you followed that order for as long as you honestly could. Why choose that particular truth? Because it was true, I said simply. I did follow it, right up until following it meant standing by and watching you die in front of me. I'm not going to pretend that particular choice was easy for me, just because it turned out afterward to be the right one. She studied me the way she had studied me since that very first afternoon back in the arena, except the expression underneath her gaze had changed entirely by now. Curiosity settled comfortably into something far steadier and more certain. My resonance sense told me from the very beginning that there was something enormous inside you, held very, very still, she said quietly. I understand now, finally, exactly what it was sensing all along. I did not understand, until only yesterday, precisely how much that constant stillness must have cost you to maintain, day after day, for so long. Every single day for 3 years, I admitted freely. It gets a little easier with practice. It never once gets easy. Then we will make it easier together, she said, one day at a time, for as long as it takes. Then perhaps, she said, turning to face me fully in the moonlight, you should finally stop holding quite so much of yourself still, now that you no longer have any real reason left to hide what you truly are from the one person who chose you before she ever had any proof at all to go on. The formal bonding ceremony took place 3 full weeks later, once the detailed terms of Earth's revised status within the Empire had been settled thoroughly enough to make the union politically survivable as well as simply personally desired by both of us. It was noticeably smaller than court tradition usually demanded for a royal bonding, held deliberately in that same garden where 4 Ashbourne operatives had once tried to end her life, because Kyriel insisted firmly that the place which had nearly taken everything from her should also become the place that gave her everything back in return. Lord Kesh attended quietly, standing at the far edge of the ceremony with the careful posture of a man still working out exactly how he felt about the ultimate outcome of his own long investigation, though I noticed he stayed until the very end, considerably longer than strict duty alone would have required of him. I stood facing Kyriel under those same 2 familiar moons, 3 years of careful secrecy finally behind me at last, dressed in a simple version of Threscan ceremonial cloth that felt strange against skin, used to arena sand and prison gray. She wore blue and silver, the same colors from that very first afternoon in the royal box, and for a moment I could almost believe none of it had changed at all, except that this time she was looking at me, and I was finally looking back without anything left to hide. I thought quietly about the 8 other soldiers who had gone through Project Arsenal alongside me, 6 of whom never lived long enough to see whether hiding what we became would ultimately prove worth the terrible cost. I thought about Elena Brooks, still running a resistance that officially did not exist anywhere on paper, still sending careful, coded messages through channels an entire empire preferred to pretend it never noticed at all. Her final message had reached me 2 full days before the ceremony itself, shorter than any message that came before it, and it stayed with me longer than all the others combined. You were never the only one we sent out into the dark, Ethan. Just the first one we happened to hear from again. I did not yet know what that particular message truly meant for the others, scattered somewhere across an empire far larger than the small corner of it I had personally come to call home. I knew only that the arena had once been the single place I was ever allowed to fight honestly, and now, standing beside a princess who had chosen the truth beneath my skin long before she ever saw any real proof of it, I finally understood something I had missed for 3 entire years. Hiding had never actually been the same thing as surviving. Surviving, I was only now truly beginning to learn, meant being fully seen, completely, by someone who chose to stay anyway, knowing everything. Whatever waited for us next, whatever those other scattered soldiers eventually turned out to be, I intended to face all of it the same way I had finally faced this, standing in the open, in full view, beside the one person who had never once needed the mask to know exactly what she was looking at.